on signing the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or DSHEA, into law on October 25, 1994, President Clinton said, and I quote, "After several years of intense efforts, manufacturers, experts in nutrition, and legislators, acting in a conscientious alliance with consumers at the grassroots level, have moved successfully to bring common sense to the treatment of dietary supplements under regulation and law." Now, the industry was valued at about $4 billion back then, with about 4,000 products on the market. Today, it's between $40 and $50 billion, and there are upwards of 80,000 products around. While the world has changed significantly over the last 2.5 decades, the regulations underlying dietary supplements have endured, with a few key amendments. Now, over the course of the next hour, we are going to take a deep dive into DSHEA. We're going to go on a little trip down memory lane. We're going to look at how the industry has evolved over the last 25 years, and then we're going to talk about what comes next. And who better to lead us on this little trip than two of the key architects of the actual law? I am very pleased to be joined by Loren Israelsen, who is president of the United Natural Products Alliance, and Scott Bass, who is a partner at Sidley Austin. Now, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
It is.
So now, I'm going to start off and say the doors are locked. We're not leaving here until we get through all of my questions. But don't worry, if you get hungry, I have a salami sandwich that you can share. And I believe there is a story about doors being locked in a pastrami sandwich. Am I right, Loren?
You are correct.
You want to lead me off?
Yeah,
Take me back to that night.
We are locked up in it was the Russell Building, as I recall. And this was the negotiating team. We were down to the final days of DSHEA. And we were literally locked into a room, and the deal was, if anybody left, that was it. You were out of the room. So there were no breaks. There was no food, and Scott and I were sitting next to each other, and little do I know that he smuggled in a sandwich. So I'm beginning to hear the little rustling sounds. I look over, and the next thing I see is that he's slipping me a half a sandwich so that we can just try and stay in the game here, on the view that this was going to go for quite a while. And so one of the many memories of the DSHEA era is where Scott and I were flying wingman for each other over what was really a remarkable ride that deserves to be told. The story has never been fully told, so we appreciate this opportunity.
All right, so take me back, Scott, to that night, and then we'll go back a little bit further before then. Those last few hours of DSHEA, I imagine it's very tense. People are haggling over some of the things. It could even be make or break at some point. Take us back. What is that like?
What people don't realize is this unanimously passed law was actually passed only because of the brilliance of the strategy of Senator Orrin Hatch. What happened was Loren and I were in that last-ditch effort to revive the law that he just described. We spent, 10 hours in the basement. And then the following week, our counter-negotiator, Congressman Waxman's lead person, had made a deal in the Senate to kill the bill. So the Senate kept the clock, as they often do. The session ended for the year at midnight, but it was now almost 3 a.m., and they moved the clock back in their hands. And 5 minutes before the end of the session, or 10 minutes, Metzenbaum pulled DSHEA as a matter of right. But Senator Hatch had been prepared with all of the liberal Democratic federal judicial nominees and pulled those. So in the last minute, suddenly there was a hand vote, I guess, unanimously passing a law, and then in the House. And that law, after 2.5 years of contentious, wild behavior, became the law.
Wow. So take me back to the early 90s now, because this was a period of just immense activity in and around supplements, right? So in 1990, you have the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which was kind of set the rules for health claims. You got FDA stating that herbs were not eligible for health claims because they were not recognized as nutrients.
Correct.
And then you've got Senator Hatch floating a one-page bill that then grew into the Health Freedom Act of 1992.
By the way, you mentioned that. I remember Loren and I became good friends in 1990 when we were drafting the NLEA exception for supplements. And then I remember to this day that DSHEA really started in a call between Loren and me in December of '91 on a snowy day when we were all flying in to Colorado for a meeting of industry, and we looked at each other and said, this is it. The FDA has fired the shot across the bow on that statement that you made about herbs not being nutritional. And that's when Loren, the people in Utah, went to Hatch, and that's how it started.
So it was very much Utah that was the driving force of this.
It was a centerpiece. Several reasons that Senator Hatch, who I had known since the late 70s, having worked in his office in his first year of his first term. And he is a true believer. He uses dietary supplements. He respects the natural health and wellness philosophy, practices it. And he had long said to many of our friends in Utah that should the time come and you need my help, let me know. And the cascade of events that Scott mentions began to build up. On top of that, there were other crazy things that were happening. It was the raid on Dr. Jonathan Wright's clinic in Tacoma, Washington, that sparked a fury in the media in the Northwest. And this is a guns drawn, flak jackets, everybody on the ground raid of a doctor's office. He was using injectable vitamin B12 and selling supplements. For this interview, I pulled the file out and just reread the clippings at that time, and it just immediately took me back to just the energy of the time, that there was this growing foreboding in our industry that FDA had been taking aggressive actions against companies, that this task force report that FDA issued in June of 1992 was alarming. And
so this is the one that was amino acids should be regulated as drugs.
Correct.
Because of L-tryptophan.
Yes, this was known as the Dykstra report, after Gary Dykstra, who was a senior official at FDA, who had the misfortune of chairing this task force. And a very nice guy. And he had the unfortunate job of taking this assignment on. When you read the report, if there was any doubt in anyone's mind what the future was as far as FDA was concerned, it was right there in text. That vitamins would be capped based on potency. That was the working premise, and that they would use the OTC monograph process to do that. Amino acids would largely be seen as drugs, and others, as it was then called, would remain food additives to allow FDA maximum enforcement discretion. Well, that coupled with the NLEA, which had cut out non-nutrients, and Scott and I and others were desperately trying to get Congress to understand that they were doing something good, creating health claims, but in the course of doing that, they had created a real problem for all of these non-nutrient products. They didn't have time to deal with it. NLEA passes, so that was when the clock really began to tick in terms of something is likely to happen. And then in '92, you have this boom, boom, boom of events. And in Utah, being an epicenter of the industry, there was a deep sense of threat.
Did you say an epicenter? How
epicenter.
can something be an epicenter?
A epicenter.
Jesus.
I'm always being corrected.
You know, just Loren. By the way, one thing
The
to
English
add,
teacher.
Here's a very good point you made. This goes back to 1964. So
Yeah.
Utah became a big player in the late 70s, but starting in '64, you had people in the East who were rebelling against all these vitamin mineral limits, and there were major cases against FDA for a period of 10 years, which they lost, by the way. And citizen marches on Washington in 1973, leading to the Proxmire amendments in 1973. And so this was all, actually you're right, that it wasn't just the whole effort by Commissioner Kessler, it was also 30 or 40 years of resentment and bad court decisions, and FDA using crazy theories to keep products, as Loren said, as food additives so they could have pre-approval authority. So really built up, and you had two groups always. I always found it interesting. You had the far right and the far left. You had the hippies.
It's true.
And the far right.
It's true that it was a very odd collection of political views, of regionality in the industry, that there's a very distinct Northeast corridor in Long Island in particular. You had the Utah culture, and then you had the West Coast, which was essentially seen as the hippie community within the industry. And when you got these three sets together, it was hilarious. You could tell who was who with one glance. You knew who was...
It was Messianic, and it was religious. At least 2/3 of it was religious.
Yeah, and a third were high, and a third were sober. And a third were cutting deals on the side.
Exactly.
It was a strange combination of players that got together, but under a common banner. And with any interesting movement, you typically see that. And this was certainly true of our industry, is that we had a common enemy, as it were, and a common objective. And we set aside a lot of the usual differences that would express itself in the course of the industry. But we did see over the course of DSHEA that flared often, is that we had as much trouble trying to negotiate within the industry as we were dealing with members of Congress that were on the other side of the table. And it was not without note that very often people were trying to cut side deals. And it was a sense of allegiance, I think, is that you really had to trust people.
Yes.
That when you're in a room and you're working on very sensitive negotiations, that it's paramount that it stays in the room. And I think that's one thing that Scott and I had an absolute trust with each other, that it was in the vault. It was protected for sure.
So who were some of the key personalities back then from all these different factions, and who was responsible for?
Other than Loren? Well, I guess Jerry Kessler, who passed away.
Yeah,
right?
Jerry Kessler would have to
Talk about messianic.
be on the list. Jerry was a very unusual, colorful guy, very tall. He had a very distinctive booming voice. He also physically was quite distinct, that you would always know Jerry was coming just by his gait. And he had a very clear sense, literally messianic, not making that up. And
Yes, quite.
it was Scott's job to try and manage Jerry. You're both East Coast guys, you deal with each other. Jerry was hard to manage, but Scott did it as well as anybody could. And he comes to mind. Jerry had a ranch right next to Michael Jackson in California. So we had, I think, was it Neverland?
Mm-hmm.
And then we had Jerryland. And there were a couple of meetings at his ranch that were interesting.
Where everyone was jockeying to be leaders, and he and I would be sitting there on the Hill and elsewhere saying, sure, 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 and trying to keep these people, give them their, and then we had the citizens groups, remember?
Yes, Citizens for Health was an important group. There were a number of people that were involved in that. That became a real grassroots entity that did a lot of hard work and made a real difference trying to
Well, there was
rally.
a true story, right, that the phones rang off the hook so much that the legislators couldn't get calls out, and they had more
yeah.
calls and letters on this than on any issue since the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And that was coordinated, or that was?
Yes, that was coordinated.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody. We had a blackout day of all retail stores. They
Multiple
covered
blackout
products.
days. Yeah. They would cover in some black, whatever black you wanted. Just cover the supplement section. Customers would walk in. What's the deal with this? And to say, that's what your future looks like if you don't sign this petition and make a phone call. So on the checkout counter normally would be a phone, and there would be a petition form. And remember, this is 92 to 94. This is pre-internet. The DSHEA passes and the internet is born the next morning is basically what happened.
we really missed that. You know, it's interesting. Loren always had a better handle on the core concept, because I was trying to draft a law, and so the concept, the overriding concept, which he understood very deeply, was freedom of choice. I kept saying, hey, wait, that's not a legal concept. And Loren would talk to me and say, yeah, but we've got to remember that's what's unifying everyone. And that was it. That was the unifying
That was the
concept.
unifying principle. And interestingly, today is Tuesday. Yesterday, Monday, Commissioner Gottlieb issues a press statement noting that now 25 years after the anniversary of DSHEA, here we are, that FDA is interested in updating its process procedures and its views of how dietary supplements should be regulated. And they noted, interestingly, that they felt it would be appropriate to examine amendments to DSHEA. And that's another fascinating point we'll no doubt get to, is how durable this statute was in terms of its watertight welding. And a lot of people tried to crack it open over the years.
But you know, you and I never wanted one change. I've actually changed my mind because of this mandatory listing issue, and also because I know the FDA we have now is the best FDA we'll get. It's an FDA that actually believes. I thought that announcement gave credibility for the first time in 50 years by FDA to the legitimacy of this industry, to innovation, but also called, Loren and I have talked about this, I think the industry has never grown up and hasn't taken on responsibilities it needs to, and it's time for a change on both sides.
I want to get to the Gottlieb stuff right at the end, because then we'll kind of look forward. So I want to kind of pull you back.
Sorry, we jumped ahead, yeah.
It's all right, it's all right. So yeah, pulling you back to when, and Scott, when you were drafting it, and you were, how quickly did it come together as a law? How much, chopping and changing?
Loren was heavily involved in a lot of the key provisions later, but it started out from Bill Richardson. Congressman Richardson introduced the first bill, which was an agglomeration. We had a meeting at my office, and Loren, of course, was a key player there, where everybody just gave us what they cared about, the 9 things they cared about. That went in as the first DSHEA law. And then it went to Hatch's office, where it was rewritten, and every single word, every definition became a major rallying cry. People accused each other. They had lawsuits over provisions. So he and I kept a steady hand, as he said, he with the rather, how can I say, active Utah folks who always wanted to take charge, and he kept everybody in line, and I wasn't as successful as some of the people in Washington, but there were a lot of groups trying to take credit all the time, and it was he and I really who were behind the doors. But it was interesting to watch, and I think to your point or question, what happened there was the fundamental concepts didn't change from day one. No food additive, meaning no prior approval. Announcements in the industry of enforcement. No drug treatment, no backdoor GMPs that would treat them as drugs. And the ability to have literature, it was called the balanced food case, have literature available on everything for people under the First Amendment. I guess those would be the primary.
There were keys, and I think that the starting point is what is now Section 201 of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act is the definition section. And we felt it was paramount to redefine what is a dietary supplement, bearing in mind that that term didn't lawfully exist until the statute passed.
So 94 was the first formal definition.
That is the first time that there was an actual legal definition of dietary supplement.
Did you mention, by the way, as the representative of the herb industry, that an herb is not really a dietary supplement? That's the irony of this whole law. Herbs are drugs, but FDA, he tried for years to get FDA to acknowledge them as traditional medicines. He even got ambassadors and others, and they just refused.
Yeah, they were not.
So this was, DSHEA was the tail that wagged the dog. It was about a drug category, herbs, being the lead in supplements.
Yeah, that is a really key point. One of the interesting battles, and this is where you saw the two factions of the industry really go at each other, is that there was one group that much preferred the term nutritional supplement. And then there was the other group that insisted that it had to be dietary, because on that, those two words would hang all the difference. Right. Nutritional has a very specific understanding. Dietary is anything that you add to the diet. And that crafting of thought and language was very intentional. And if you look back at the drafts, and I've got many boxes of the old original drafts, is that you can see the markups back and forth, where dietary would be stricken out, replaced by nutritional, and then back the other way. And this went on for quite a long time.
Still going on. 201 FF1E is still the fight over that. We took nutritional out, and FDA lawyers are still trying to put it back.
So we knew, we became very, very clear about what the fundamentals had to be and where the line had to be drawn. And that turned out to be a key one. Literature was really important. Again, this is Amazon was founded in 1994 as a point of reference. And so if you look at the evolution of what has happened from then to now on that side of the world, and you look at DSHEA, which was formed against the backdrop of 40, 50 years of history, that we really, I think, understood pretty clearly what had to change in order to protect consumer access to supplements, but also something that could be defended in court. And that led to a lot of interesting examples that we discussed in detail. How do you take a dietary supplement? It had to be ingested. Well, there was litigation over dietary supplements that you would squirt up your nose, put in your ears, on the skin. And we have always, Scott and I resolutely said, the statute's really clear, is that you need to ingest it. Now, how exactly you do that when you put it in your mouth, there's some room for discussion there. But these, and many people say, these are details. I say, yeah, these are the details that matter.
Yeah, exactly.
That on which an industry turns.
Exactly.
That investors are willing to put in a great deal of money because their lawyers tell them that that's pretty secure. Yeah, you can make an investment based on what we've read here.
And what compromises did you make along the way? Did you?
I think the biggest compromise was in the definitions, what Loren's saying. You know, one of the provisions that he's talking about at FF is the definition section. Sub 3 is we call the race to market. If it was a drug first, it can't be a supplement, although now there's a dispute about what if the drug was abandoned. But that was a big one. And also, there was much stronger feeling, particularly in Utah, having no manufacturing standards set forth. And that was, I wouldn't say compromise, but essential view. Loren and I have always been of the same mind. We have been the fiercest defenders against all changes to this, as you called it, the welded together statute. But as I said too, and we'll get to it later, I think that time has changed, meaning now after 25 years. But I think the big compromises, Loren, as I recall in that last meeting in the basement, were the definition provision on other ingredients.
Yeah.
It was partial, but although we won on nutritional. And then I guess the limitations that they put on the structure function claims, right?
Yeah, that was a clear compromise, as what we now call structure function claims. Where we had to compromise is that if you look at the title of that section 6, it's statements of nutritional support. Mm-hmm. That's where we couldn't get the word dietary changed. And that was one that we, end of the day, agreed to live with. I wish we could have had a harmonious definition dietary throughout, but that one, and we knew then, and we have seen it since, is that has been a problem going
and
forward.
Health claims, people mistakenly thought they needed health claims. I've always been of the view that they're worthless for supplements anyway because they're too long, but people fought very hard for those, and we didn't get what some people wanted.
In fact, what we now call structure function claims turned out to be something quite desirable that the food industry wishes they had.
Yes.
The pharma industry feels that we've encroached onto what the consumer perception is of a health benefit for products, and that if you line these products up, OTC drug, a fiber product and a dietary supplement, food drug, and dietary supplement, can you really tell them apart? And we felt that would likely be the case, that there would be a convergence over time, and that
there is
proven out
right?
true. That's what's
the
happening.
January 6, 2000 Federal Register notice on structure function claims, there is exactly what you said. 6 years later, convergence.
Yeah, we
Well,
saw.
actually, I read an article that you wrote, Scott, and I think you said that, you know, with the passage of DSHEA, basically like 40% or something of the OTC was ceded to dietary supplements.
Is that the figure I used?
I'm
I hope not.
paraphrasing. It was sizable.
It was a big number. Yeah, I don't know what it was, but it was a pretty
The line
big
they
number.
drew is between occasional versus recurrent, meaning if you have, for example, sleep product for constant sleep use, it's a drug, but if it's occasional sleeplessness, it's a supplement. Same thing with constipation and with fiber and all that stuff.
Chronicity has turned out to be an important distinguishing point. Mm-hmm. The other one, as I'm thinking this through, is that on the NDI provision, we had a terrible time trying to come up with a working process. And that was one of the last things that was put into the bill. We'd worked out a lot of the other parts, and then there was a lot of concern on the part of Senator Kennedy specifically and Henry Waxman and their staffers, who were very capable people. Bill Schultz, who was the staffer for Waxman, was and is an exceptionally bright, capable guy. And part of the fun of DSHEA, using that term advisedly, is that there were a lot of extremely capable people that were in these final negotiating sessions.
On both sides.
On both sides.
That's a good point. You know, actually 413 never worked. It's got too many contrary definitions. It's where the grandfather process is and new dietary ingredients. But one of the things that has to be fixed by FDA now, in fact, is that. And I think we know how to do it.
Yeah, I agree. That I think we felt that we had not fully resolved the whole NDI approach and process. The definitional piece, which is not actually in the statute, It's in separate language that defines what constitutes a change. I wish we could have had something that was more clear and robust. We didn't have time.
Yep. I just want to talk about the little disclaimer that you see on all the packages as well.
Oh, yes.
You know,
That's a
the
great
statement is
story.
not being evaluated by FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent any disease. Where did that come
Can
from?
I tell you a funny story? That comes from the same source as 413, Bill Schultz. But I'm going to tell you something
Yes.
funny about this. I'm driving the day before the bill passed, and I get a call that the whole thing's being killed because one of the trade associations had some large members who thought it would be a problem selling the product. I said, are you kidding? Call Loren. He'll tell you the same thing I will, which is that's going to be an asset in selling the product that it wasn't approved.
That's
And
a
sure
badge
enough-
of honor.
Yeah, exactly. Nobody reads that, number one. And number two, the fact it's not approved is for consumers a
To
positive.
our consumer,
Yeah.
it was no problem.
Yeah.
So I recall I was hunkered over a fax machine with Peter and Trish that were Senator Hatch and Harkin's chiefs, at that time, health policy staffers. As I remember, Scott was, I was on the Senate side. I can't remember where I was, but Scott was trying to control fires someplace else. And we were waiting for a response from the Waxman office. And we had proffered this. No, actually, they proffered the language.
That's right. That's right.
They sent it over, and I remember the fax kicking on, and the old thermal paper rolls out. And we look at this, and they said, if you will accept this wording, we're good. And we looked at it, looked at each other, and said, we're go. And we sent it back to Schultz. And there was this incredulous, you're really willing to accept that?
They thought that would kill it?
They thought that would kill it. If there was one miscalculation in retrospect on their side, that was it.
You know why? Because the player he relied upon, you know who I'm talking about,
Yeah.
told him it would be a killer, but nobody else thought it was.
That worked out. So the language went on, and I don't think it's an overstatement to say that they were dumbfounded. Because in their worldview, why would anyone buy a product that would carry such a disclaimer? I said, well, you clearly don't know our consumers.
That's right.
Okay, so you've got everything kind of ready to go. This is the 103rd Congress, if I remember, if my research is right.
That is correct.
You had a Democrat in the White House. You had Democratic majorities in both chambers. You had some big names, like you've already mentioned, Waxman, Kennedy, who were not very supportive of this.
Metzenbaum.
That's a
Dingle.
Dingle was very
Dingle.
important.
Yeah,
Very important.
and yet this went through. So how did that look behind the scenes playing?
Well, I'll
playing
tell you
that
about
game?
one meeting. Were you there at the Richardson meeting after it passed through Senate committee? We had a meeting.
Pretty sure, yeah, I was.
5 of us were there, and he looked at us, tie loose, and said, look, I'm not your boy, Orrin. He said, this bill's dead. It's not going anywhere unless Orrin can cross from the Senate and the House and save it. It's over. This is 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before it passed. So that's when the famous meeting with Loren and me in the basement, Hatch called up Dingle, who was on the other side, but you know, they had a lot of, in those days, people in opposite parties actually worked together occasionally. And so he said, do me a favor, have your senior staffer, he had a brilliant senior staffer, put together a meeting, and Trish Knight came over, and Peter, you know, great staff members who were really smart, and that's the meeting we had to save the bill. It was basically dead 3-4 weeks before it passed, and that was the behind the scenes that I saw. I don't know what you saw.
Yeah, you know, this is the Rasputin bill. It lived and died more times than you can imagine. That moments of elation where we think we finally got this thing. The problem is this never went through a markup in the House. Never. That is extremely unusual for a major piece of legislation to pass without ever going through a markup on one of the two chambers. I was concerned, for the same reason Scott was, is that the setup had been organized basically is to hand a live grenade to the Senate side. The driver, there were two things. One is that the Republican wave, you could feel in Congress that they could see that the Democrats were probably going to get wiped out. And somewhere along the line, the light went on for some of these key senior leadership offices is You know, this very, very pesky group that wants this dietary supplement bill are driving a tremendous numbers of consumers. We have seen them. The calls, the faxes, the rallies, is if we can work a deal out, maybe that will dissipate a lot of the anger that would likely be channeled against the Democrats in the November 94 elections. In my view, that was a motivator. The Speaker of the House was Tom Foley. He lost in that election that followed. Newt Gingrich came into power as the Speaker, and Foley, the Democrat from Washington State, was defeated. So the midnight passage of the bill on the House side was remarkable. And then the handoff to the Senate side was, now you guys can take care of business because the procedural rules are different. Any member of the Senate can pick up the phone, which happened to be Senator Metzenbaum, to put a hold on the bill, and that would effectively kill it. So as you're going through these final UC or unanimous consent read-ins, well, all you got to do is put the bill on hold. It gets literally pulled out of a stack. And unless you can get it back into a stack, that they'll get read through, gavel is done, and everybody's out of there.
And that was all set up the day we had that basement meeting. When we reached agreement with Waxman's person, he set it up so that whatever we agreed to would be killed at the last minute.
We were not
unaware
of that.
Yes.
And part of the challenge was to figure out who would be the sniper. And we had 3 or 4 ideas of who it might be.
But those two, don't forget, drafted Hatch Waxman together.
That's right. So it was a really unusual dynamic as between Senator Hatch and Senator Kennedy, very good friends. As everyone knows, a very unlikely combination of personalities and political views. But you had the same with Senator Hatch and Harkin. I mean, Tom Harkin really came onto the scene and did a masterful job to really carry the water on the Democratic side of the Senate. And so this is really, that, as it was referred to very often, the Hatch-Harkin bill. And what still is a testament to how Congress should work is those two offices, the Hatch-Harkin offices, had a highly trusted relationship between their staffers, who are still very active in the industry, thankfully, because they carry an institutional knowledge of what happened. And that will become very important now as we're going into what some will refer to as the DSHEA 2.0 time period.
I also want to talk about David Kessler. So he was commissioner of the FDA at the time. And there was an article that was authored by Peter Barton Hutt, who's obviously a name that everyone in the industry knows. And he had made this statement. He said, in retrospect, the entire dietary supplement industry owes its current stature and economic strength to Kessler. Without him, DSHEA would never have been enacted. It was his arrogance and political insensitivity that allowed the champions of dietary supplements to carry their message to the American people, and it was the American people that rejected Kessler's attempt to ban dietary supplements. I have often remarked that the dietary supplement industry should erect a monument to him in commemoration of his tremendous service to the industry.
I will tell you a very funny story that embodies that. So Loren and I was called by Commissioner Kessler, the 15 people who led the industry effort. I shouldn't say 15, it was fewer than that because Trish and Peter were there. And we were summoned into a round major office of the commissioner where he had everybody behind him standing in public service whites, essentially Navy uniforms, white hat, white uniform. He had 2 desks facing each other, each about 15 feet long. He sat in the center of one. Loren and I sat with another lawyer in the center of the other. And the meeting began as follows. He stood up and yelled and pointed his finger at me and said, "Scott, you can't win." That's how the meeting started. This was August of 1993. So I looked around, confirmed with Loren, I said, "You can't win, it's not about money." And that is, to me, the embodiment of everything you just asked about.
Yeah.
He was a brilliant guy, still is, and I think there was just, historical antipathy towards supplements. It goes back to medical school since post-World War II, and that carried over, and that arrogance was just an assumption that you can run because so many of the players were, shall we say, not university professors.
Yes. it was highly unusual for an FDA commissioner to get that personally and politically involved in any bill before Congress. That is highly unusual. Normally, FDA stands off, and HHS, the parent agency, will do that sort of liaison work with the Congress. And this is an exception to that general principle. And as Scott said earlier, and I fully agree, is that we have an opportunity with the current commissioner, who I believe has both understood the lessons of the past, and he brings a very different view and a very different temperament to this discussion that we will be having. And that is a very encouraging sign, and that the leadership at the Office of Dietary Supplements at FDA likewise has shown, I would say, not only a spirit of cooperation, but a sincere interest to continue to allow broad consumer access, but to carry out their mandate, which is the point they're making.
I agree with that. It's a total different attitude.
And that will be all the difference if we end up back in Congress, if we all conclude that there is a pathway to look at. And we'll get to that, I'm sure, in the conversation about what will that look like.